In the last course section, we learned how proper naming can help us with the code readability and therefore with the maintainability of code. In this course section, we're going to dive into things we can do beyond naming things to improve readability or to hurt it, as you will learn, because this section is about comments and code formatting. And it turns out that both can be used to improve our code or to make it worse. Therefore, we'll learn that comments are mostly bad, but I will also explain which kind of comments would be good. We will learn that code formatting is important and how to format our code, also how to adhere to language conventions. And of course, again, we'll have examples, demos, and a challenge for you so that you again are able to apply all these concepts not just in theory, but also in your own projects. So what can we say about comments? Well, just one main thing. Typically, you want to avoid them. Of course, there are a couple of exceptions though. But indeed, a lot of comments are just bad. For example, because they simply convey redundant information. Have a look at this code snippet. The comments you see here are pretty much redundant. For example, this comment, the database engine to which we want to connect. Well, if that's what we have here, why don't we just name it DB engine and use that name in our code instead of DB driver? Also, these comments here. Connect to the SQL driver if driver is set to SQL. Well, this should be obvious. If you use proper names, as we now do in this example, you shouldn't need any explanatory comments, because the names should be self-explanatory already. And this code reads just fine without comments. Actually, the comments even make it a bit harder to understand it because there is extra text to read. And you will probably not skip this text if you go through the code because it might contain important information. So here you have a great example where comments actually make it harder to understand the code. Another kind of bad comments would be dividers, or comments that simply mark a block of code. Again, here's an example from the same file. I got these big markers here, which basically just inform the developer going through this code file that we're defining a couple of globals and then a couple of classes. Well, again, this should be obvious. I mean, we don't have to tell anyone that we're defining a couple of classes. We can tell by the class keyword. So comments like this also should be redundant. And if you feel the need for introducing them, then you might simply have too much code in one file, and you might want to consider splitting your code across multiple files instead. Amongst the worst kinds of comments are misleading comments. For example, consider this comment here. We say that we're updating a user, but actually the name implies that we're inserting a user, which is not the same as updating. So what are we doing? What the comment says or what the name says? So all of a sudden a name which was good now is a name we have to question, and we have to dive into the insert method to see what it really does. So that's a great example where a comment does not help us at all. If the insert method would really be updating a user, we of course should rename it. And if we can't rename it because it's from some badly written third-party library or for whatever reason, then we should at least update the comment to be something like this, where it now really makes it clear that the comment is right and not the method. Of course, we should still rename the method as soon as possible though. Now, another practice which you see quite often is commented out code. And I will say, I myself do comment out code, for example in some of my other courses, to keep it around for reference or to, well, keep it in sight whilst we maybe replace it with new code. I'm fine with doing that, but you shouldn't permanently comment out code. If you really have code which you don't need anymore, you should just remove it. Nowadays, we should be using version control systems like Git anyways, and therefore we can always bring back deleted code if we really need it. So don't be afraid of deleting code, just do it if you don't need it anymore. So instead of keeping around code like this, we should just delete it and then simply commit this change. And assuming that we also committed changes before we deleted it, we can always go back to these older states if we need that code again. Now, as you saw, many comments are bad, but actually there also are acceptable or good comments out there. For example, one kind of comment you will see in some code files would be legal information. Again, this example code file from before, which contains many bad comments, it also does have such a legal disclaimer or such a legal comment right at the top. And depending on the kind of project you're working on, you might be required to add something like this to every code file you write. Of course, if it's your own project, you can decide this on your own if you need that or not, but in a lot of organizations, you might be required to add something like this. And then, of course, it's absolutely fine to do so. I mean, you don't really have an alternative to that anyways. It doesn't really hurt the code readability though, because it sits right at the top of the file. It's clear that it contains legal information, and therefore it can easily be skipped and ignored. Now, another kind of comment which is actually good is a comment that adds an explanation which can't be delivered or replaced by proper naming. And this would be an example. We're using a regular expression, and even though that's a relatively simple one, regular expressions can get quite long. And having a little comment next to it which simply explains what this regular expression does or checks for can be worth a lot. Another kind of comment which could make sense would be a comment that warns you of something. For example, here we have a comment warning us that this specific API, the local storage API, is only available in JavaScript running in the browser, not running on another machine with Node.js, for example. Now, we can always argue whether we really need this comment. I mean, after all, you could expect fellow developers to be aware of that, or you might want to place it in a try-catch block or some if statement anyways. But if you have neither of that, for some good reason, then adding a warning like that could make sense. Now, last but not least, a comment which is also okay to have would be a to-do note. You see one here. Even though that file had a lot of bad comments, this is not one of the bad comments. This to-do note can make sense. Now, of course, we could argue whether we should have an empty method where everything is missing, and if it wouldn't be better to just remove it and then add it all in one go. But if you do have some code which is unfinished, adding a note like this can indeed make sense and can be okay. Of course, you shouldn't overdo it though, and instead you should focus on writing code which you finish instead of leaving unfinished code sitting around in your code base. Now, one last kind of comment which can make sense is a comment where you add documentation, especially when providing a public API. So methods, properties, classes, which can be used by other people, not just in your organization, but maybe also from all around the world. If you're building a library which you want to share as a third-party library with other people. Then adding documentation strings, which can be picked up by IDEs, for example, of course also makes sense. And here it then really comes down to the programming language you're using. For example, for Python, you have a certain structure for how such documentation strings should look, and other programming languages might bring their own conventions. So documentation comments are a special kind of comment which can make sense depending on which kind of project you are working on. And that is already it for comments. Hence, the general rule really is that you should avoid comments with the few exceptions I showed you over the last minutes. Now, where comments can rarely help and often hurt our code, code formatting is another thing which is really helpful when it comes to improving the readability and understandability of our code. Because code formatting improves readability and helps us transport meaning across our code. And we can differentiate between two kinds of code formatting: vertical formatting and horizontal formatting. Vertical formatting simply refers to any formatting, any code structuring we do from the top to the bottom of our file, so vertically. That includes spacing between lines and grouping of code. And I will show you concrete examples in just a second. Horizontal formatting, on the other hand, is everything which happens within one line of code, so horizontally. And that involves indentation, space between code in one line of code, and of course in general the width of our code lines. Now when it comes to formatting and formatting properly, It is of course true that formatting is important and helps us with code readability, but only if it's done properly. And here we'll not just have some general rules and concepts which I will show you over the next lectures, but we'll also have language-specific formatting rules, where most of the concepts shown in this course apply across all languages. We also have formatting rules which differ between different programming languages. And it's always the general conventions and style guides of these languages which you want to follow when it comes to formatting. So for example, if you think about indentation, something I will come back to in a second, and you think about whether you want to indent by 2 spaces or 4 spaces or by using tabs, then it's always also the language guidelines and style guides which you will typically find, which answer the question on how to indent properly. So you never want to forget about these. Nonetheless, there also are some general rules and concepts which always apply. And these are the rules and concepts we're now going to have a closer look at. So let's now take a closer look at these 2 kinds of formattings, and let's understand which kind of rules we should follow there. Now let's start with vertical formatting. Vertical formatting is about using the vertical space in our code file. And there we have one simple rule. Your code should be readable like an essay, top to bottom, without too many jumps. And this is something you already heard in the first course section. Your code should be nice to read, almost like an essay. And if you read a book, you also don't want to jump from page 1 to page 3 and from the start of page 3 to the end of page 3 before you continue in the middle of page 3. Right? You want to have one smooth reading flow. And we want to have the same for the code we write. Now, to achieve this smooth reading flow for our code, there are a couple of rules and concepts we can keep in mind and follow. For example, if your file becomes too big, if it houses too many different concepts, you want to consider splitting it across multiple files. Now, there is no hard rule on how many lines of code in one file are considered to be too big. But in general, whenever you have a file with a lot of different concepts, for example, multiple classes being defined in one file, then it is probably too big and you should split your file into multiple files. For example, as a rule of thumb, if you are working with classes, it is a good rule that you should have one class per file, not more than that. And this will help with keeping your files short and therefore readable. Now, within one and the same file, you will still have multiple different concepts. And with concepts here, I don't mean different classes or anything like that, but for example, simply multiple methods within one and the same class. That could be different concepts, different areas of code, you could say, and you should separate those concepts by spacing. And here's an example. We start by importing from a third-party package, or in this case actually from the Node.js core library. So in this case, some core functionalities which are built into Node.js, which is a JavaScript runtime. I'm importing these functionalities, and then I'm defining a class. The disk storage class, which has a constructor, and then various methods for creating directories and for inserting files. Also for handling the completion of our operations and for handling errors. And then at the very bottom, I instantiate this class twice to have different storages, different folders, and then I insert different files into these storages. Now what you will notice is that I have some blank lines in this code file. And in general, throughout all the examples I showed you up to this point, I do have blank lines. And you should have blank lines. Because these blank lines create vertical space. And this space makes the code more readable. Consider this alternative version of this file. It's the exact same code, but I did remove all the blank lines. All of a sudden, it's way harder to read. It's way harder to tell what belongs together and what doesn't. It's way harder to tell where a method starts and where it ends. Even though I did not remove indentation or anything like that, it's just the blank lines which are gone. And this shows us how important and helpful vertical space is. So you should introduce blank lines and therefore vertical space between different blocks of code, different areas of code. For example, here I start with my imports, then I have a blank line before I start with the class definition. Then we can add one between the class definition and the constructor. We definitely should add one between the constructor and the next method, and between all other methods, to make it clear that these are different methods and that it's not one huge method. Once the class definition is done, I add a blank line here before I start using the class, then one after that before I start using the instantiated classes in that new timer which I set here. And then I have no blank lines between all these lines because I'm doing the same thing just on different storages. So that is closely related and the same kind of action. Now obviously you should structure the code in a way that makes sense to you, but adding vertical spacing is definitely something you should do. So different concepts should be separated. Similar concepts, on the other hand, should not be separated by spacing. And that's what you, for example, saw in these or in these lines here, where I basically have the same kind of operation. I instantiate my disk storage, or then I insert files, and hence there is no real reason for a separation. It's the same kind of task, the same kind of thing which is being done there, hence I keep that close to each other. Now, last but not least, we also should keep related concepts close to each other. At least we should consider doing this. And indeed, if you have a look at this demo file, you will see that in the constructor, I call the setup storage directory method, and it is the very next method in line. In there, I call the create storage directory method then, and that is the next method in line. Now here I point at the handle operation completion method, and it's not the next method in line, instead it is down there, but simply because in between I have another method which will also point at this handle operation completion. However, in handle operation completion, I then point at handle file system error, and that is a method which is right below handle operation completion. So I'm keeping these related methods, or these methods which are calling each other, close to each other, at least in the places where this is possible. Technically, we could also take this insert file with data code and remove it from here and, for example, add it here between setup storage directory and create storage directory. Everything would work, the code would not break, but it would be harder to read. If we go through this file, we see that we're calling some create storage directory method here, but we don't see that method immediately. Hence, we have to scroll through the entire file and search for it. Obviously, this is a small class, so it's okay, but still, it's unnecessary work. It doesn't read smoothly. We have a jump in our file. And as I explained a couple of minutes ago, we want to avoid such jumps. After all, when we read a book, we also don't have such jumps. Hence, the better place for insert file with data is not between two methods which are closely related, but somewhere else, where it's not directly between related methods. Now, with the concept of keeping related concepts close to each other, we already touched on ordering. And ordering, of course, also is important when it comes to formatting your code. Now, the rules on how to order things in a class and outside of a class always also depend on the programming language you're using. For example, if you have a language which knows the concept of public and private properties and methods, there often are rules on what should come first. For example, that you start with the public properties, then you have the private properties, and then you continue with the public methods followed by the private methods, or the other way around. So when it comes to this specific ordering, it is the style guides of a language you might want to consult. But besides that, the concepts explained throughout the last lectures apply nonetheless, no matter which programming language you are using. Now, before we dive into horizontal formatting, let's also talk about this reading flow again. Here's another example. It's a JavaScript file where I call a start function, which then is defined right below it, so that we can immediately see it. And that calls a next function, which is defined right below, and the same is true for the last function. Now, if I would execute this file, it would work, and I would log all these log messages. JavaScript is a language which supports this syntax. We can call a function before it was defined, because when JavaScript executes, it automatically pulls all the functions in front of the other code, so to say. On the other hand, there are other languages, like Python, where this is different. Here, if we would call start in line 2, it wouldn't work. This code would fail if we tried to execute it. Because in Python, we can't execute a function before it was defined. It will not magically be pulled on top of the file, as it was the case with JavaScript. So executing start in line 2 wouldn't work. However, executing it in line 11 here in this example also wouldn't work. Yes, start would be defined, but in start I call next, and next at this point of time, when code execution reaches line 11, is still unknown. Hence, the only place where we can call start here is after all these functions have been defined, so that they can call each other successfully. So here it's really just about when we start that function execution, and then Python simply requires that it saw every function which is called by some other place in the code before it's being called. And therefore, of course, again, you have to keep such language-specific rules and restrictions in mind when it comes to ordering and executing your functions. Now let's move on to horizontal formatting. With horizontal formatting, we are talking about a single line of code, and that these lines of code should be readable without horizontal scrolling. So we should simply avoid very long, unreadable sentences. And that all starts with indentation. We should use indentation even if it's not required technically. Now here is an extreme example. This again is the disk storage class from before, with the same code as before, but I changed the constructor. I removed all indentation, and instead I put all the code in one line. It looks like this. It's a very long line of code, and we have to scroll horizontally in order to read it. This code would execute. This is technically valid JavaScript code, but of course it's not readable at all. Hence, we should use multiple lines and also indentation to make it readable. Because like this, it's perfectly readable. If we just had multiple lines, but no indentation at all, and if it looked like this, therefore, it would be readable, but especially for longer functions, it's not necessarily immediately obvious that this code all belongs in one and the same function. So using multiple shorter lines and using indentation helps a lot with code readability and understandability. Now, in addition to using indentation, you should also break long statements into multiple shorter ones. And with that, I don't just mean the extreme example I showed you a minute ago. For example, consider line 19 here. I changed this line to be a bit longer, because I'm not referring to this storage path property of the class anymore, which holds the storage path, but I'm creating the path in line instead. And therefore we have a rather long line here. In such cases, it would be better to extract this code into a separate variable or constant, like this for example, and then use this variable or constant. Now it's way more readable, even though it's the same code as before. But we simply split this long line into multiple lines. Now last but not least, when it comes to horizontal formatting, you should also use clear and descriptive, but not unreadably long names. Names of variables and properties and methods can be a bit longer. This is totally fine. They can consist of multiple words. But consider this extreme example. I now renamed this constant to be very descriptive. It's the storage path for storing images in a temporary folder for the year 2020. Now this is a very descriptive name, but it doesn't help with readability. It's simply too long. It hides the rest of the line, which would actually be more explanatory than the long name. Because if we would see this code immediately, it would be pretty clear that we are creating an images folder in some temp folder, which is somehow related to the year 2020. This would be much clearer than if we have to read this long name. In addition, this long name does not just impact line 19, but also line 20, where we use this long name. This line now also is partially hidden and requires some scrolling. Of course, always depending on your zoom level, but still, it's a way too long line, and hence here, the older name was definitely better and helped with readability way more. Now we saw all the rules, we had a look at all the rules, and I showed you a couple of examples. Now it's time for your challenge. So attached you find the challenge py file, it's therefore written in Python. And this file has some code. You can execute it, though I will say it will fail. You can fix it, and you'll find ideas on how to fix it in the code file. But the main priority is not that you fix this file, that you can execute it, but that you fix the comments and the formatting in the file. Not everything is wrong. Indeed, it isn't too bad, but there are a couple of things which can be improved. And I want you to go through this file, have a look at all the different comments and the formatting and the code you see here, and see how you could improve it. And then, of course, compare your solution to mine so that you also see how I transformed this file. So here's my approach to refactoring and to improving this file. And I want to start with the comments. We got a legal comment right here at the start, and as you learned, legal comments are alright if we need to add them. Obviously here I personally don't need to add it, but let's assume I am in an organization where I am required to do that, then it's of course fine to keep this around. Not fine, however, are these markers here, these dividers. Yes, these are the imports, but guess what? I can tell that they are by the fact that we have the import keyword here. And that this here is the main code, well, obviously it is. It is the only remaining code in the file. So we should remove these dividers or these markers here. Now regarding this comment, this is not a documentation comment, not a valid documentation comment as it should be written in Python. There you would use a special syntax with triple quotes, but that's just a Python thing. But we actually don't even need it here, because this comment doesn't make any sense. It's a class which allows us to create an instance of this class. Well, that is what classes typically do, so this is a redundant comment, and hence I will also remove it. Now, further down, I got 3 other comments. For example, that create directory must be called before a file is inserted. This, by the way, is the reason why executing this file would fail. You need to call log storage create directory before you call insert file. But I will remove this for now. We got a warning here, and we learned that warnings can make sense. However, we actually got this warning twice, here and then here. And if we add this warning, I would argue it makes sense in the place where things can fail. So in this case, insert file. It's good to know that we should call create directory before we insert a file, but what does this annotation add if it is next to create directory? This is not what will fail after all. Hence, I will remove this comment and leave this warning, though of course I want to emphasize that the better way of dealing with this would be to properly handle the scenario that a directory does not exist yet. So for example, to check for its existence and create it if it's missing and only continue if it exists. Nonetheless, if that's not the case, we may keep such a warning comment around, though of course it is also worth knowing that this comment can only be seen if we dive into this code base, not if we just call insert file. Nonetheless, if we call that and it fails and we then dive into the code base, this warning comment might help us with identifying the problem a bit quicker. Now this last comment here is a to-do comment, and as I said, adding proper error handling definitely is a good idea here. You should just do it instead of mentioning that you should do it, but mentioning it at least is a good step in the right direction, so I will leave it here. And that's it for comments. Now let's talk about formatting. The good thing is we got some vertical spacing here. So we got the imports, then we got this class, we got spacing between all these methods, and that's all good. And we also have spacing down there. So that all doesn't look too bad, though we could also remove the spacing down there and argue that the log storage here is created, and then we operate on this created log storage. So we could also keep these two lines together. In the JavaScript example from before, that was not the case. There we had some spacing between the creation of the storages and the file insertion, but I primarily added this because I also have this set timeout function in between. If that would not be there, an argument could be made that these lines should be right after these lines. Ultimately, that also comes down to your own preference and to what you think is easier to read. Here you can go for either of the two approaches, and hence I will remove the vertical spacing, though keeping it also would be absolutely fine. If we have a look at the methods, all the spacing looks good to me, at least the vertical one. But what about horizontal spacing? We got no super long lines here, and yet I see some small improvement potentials. For example, here. This is not too long, but it could grow over time. Here we are constructing a file path in the end, and hence what we could do is we could extract it from here and simply add a new file path variable in which we then store this derived file path, and then we use this variable here. This would make this line even shorter and even a bit easier to read. So I personally am a fan of doing that. We could do something similar here for this if statement and extract this, for example, into a separate variable. But I think here it is still fine to leave it like this. But if you extracted it, that is definitely also fine. Now, last but not least, to fix this file, we can also call log storage create directory before we insert a file. And if we do that, then I am indeed a fan of reintroducing the vertical spacing here, because now we first create the storage, and then we have operations on that created storage. So you could argue that these are two different kinds of code, two different operations. So re-adding a vertical space here could be fine then. And that is it. There wasn't too much to fix, but I hope it's clear to which aspects you should pay close attention and how proper formatting and good comments can help with keeping your code readable and maintainable.